Somewhere in a government archive, there is a record that says you exist. It has your name, your date of birth, perhaps your fingerprints, a photograph. It was created at a specific moment in time when you were registered, enrolled, issued a document, and at that moment, something important happened. Someone took a claim about who you are and attached it to something physical, something only you possess, or only you can produce. They tied the claim to the body. That act has a name in security. It's called binding, and it is, without exaggeration, the most consequential step in the entire identity process. Because everything that happens afterwards, every authentication, every access decision, rests on the assumption that this binding was done correctly, that the claim really was tied to the right subject. When binding is strong, the whole system is anchored. When binding is weak, or when an attacker finds a way to substitute themselves into it, every layer built on top of it is compromised, regardless of how well designed those layers are. In this video, we're going to look closely at what binding actually means and why it is the single step that attackers most want to corrupt. Let's be precise. An identity claim, by itself, is just an assertion. A name, a username, an account number, it is text. And text, on its own, proves nothing. Anyone can write any name on a piece of paper. Binding is what transforms a claim into something that can be trusted. It is the mechanism that ties a claim to a specific subject in a way that is difficult or impossible for anyone else to replicate. Think of it as the difference between a name tag and a passport. A name tag says, "This person claims to be Alice." A passport says, "A trusted authority has verified that this person is Alice," attached that claim to her photograph and biometrics, and produced a document that is cryptographically and physically difficult to forge. The name tag is a claim. The passport is a bound identity. In digital systems, the equivalent distinction shows up constantly. A username is a claim. A username plus a cryptographic private key, where only the holder of that specific key can prove possession, is a bound identity. The binding is the key. The claim is the identifier. The two together form something that can be trusted. But notice something. The strength of a bound identity is only as good as the strength of the binding mechanism. A private key that can be extracted from an insecure device is a weak binding. A biometric system that accepts a photograph instead of a live face is a weak binding. A verification process that accepted fraudulent documents when the identity was first created is a weak binding, because the rot starts at the very first moment. Binding doesn't happen automatically. It is established through a deliberate process, and that process has 3 distinct stages. The first is identity proofing. Before a system can bind a credential to a subject, it has to have reasonable confidence that the subject is who they claim to be. This might involve checking government documents, verifying a phone number, cross-referencing a database, or in high-assurance environments, conducting an in-person check with biometric capture. Identity proofing is the foundation of the foundation. If it's done carelessly, if documents are accepted without verification, or if the check can be performed remotely in a way that's easy to spoof, then no matter how strong the cryptography that comes after it, the identity was built on a lie from day one. The second stage is credential issuance. Once the system is satisfied that the subject is genuine, it issues a credential and binds it to the identity record. This is the moment the connection is forged. A password is created and its hash is stored. A private key is generated and the corresponding public key is registered. A hardware token is enrolled. The credential becomes the proof mechanism, the thing the subject will use, from this point forward, to demonstrate that they are the subject to whom this identity belongs. The third stage is binding registration. The system records the relationship between the credential and the identity in a way that can be verified later. In cryptographic systems, this often takes the form of a certificate, a signed document that says, "This public key belongs to this subject, and I, the certificate authority, am vouching for it." The certificate is not just a label, it's a claim made by a trusted issuer that the binding is real. These 3 stages create the chain, and the entire security of the identity rests on how carefully each stage was executed. Not all bindings are equally strong, and the differences are not just technical, they have direct consequences for what attacks are possible. At the weakest end of the spectrum, a username and password, created during an online registration with no identity proofing, verified only by clicking a link in an email. Think about what that binding actually proves. Someone created an account, provided an email address they could access, and chose a password. The binding between that account and any specific real-world person is almost non-existent. The identity was never verified. The credential is a shared secret that can be guessed, stolen, or phished. And the email verification only confirms that someone could access that inbox at that moment. Move along the spectrum, multi-factor authentication adds a second layer. Now the subject has to demonstrate possession of something, a phone, a hardware key, in addition to knowing the password. The binding is stronger because it requires two independent proof mechanisms to be compromised simultaneously. Further along, cryptographic certificates with hardware-backed private keys. The private key is generated inside a secure enclave or hardware security module and cannot be extracted. Proving possession requires a live cryptographic operation. The key has to be used to sign something in real time inside the device. You cannot replay a stolen key because the key never leaves the hardware. At the strongest end, hardware-bound biometrics combined with in-person identity proofing. The credential is tied to something the subject's body physically produces, captured under controlled conditions, verified against government-issued identity documents by a real person who checked the documents were genuine. The distance between a self-registered email account and a biometrically bound certificate with in-person proofing is enormous. And yet both are described, in everyday conversation, as having an identity in the system. The practical question for any system designer, and the practical attack surface for any adversary, is, where on this spectrum does the binding sit, and is that strength appropriate for what the identity is being used to access? If binding is the foundation, then attacking the binding is the most efficient thing an adversary can do. Break it once, and every layer above it collapses. There are three ways attackers typically go after it. The first is initial proofing fraud. If the proofing stage is weak enough, an attacker doesn't need to break any cryptography at all. They simply provide fraudulent documents during registration and get a legitimate credential issued in a false identity. The binding is technically correct. The credential is genuinely tied to the registered identity. The problem is that the registered identity was never real. This is how synthetic identity fraud works in financial systems. Construct a plausible but fictional identity. Get it accepted into the proofing process, and from that point forward, operate with a legitimate credential that the system fully trusts. The second is credential theft. The binding is real, but the subject's credential gets stolen. A password is phished. A session token is intercepted. A private key is extracted from a compromised device. The attacker now holds the proof mechanism without holding the identity it was bound to. From the system's perspective, the binding looks intact, the credential is valid, the signature checks out. The problem is that the person presenting it is not the person it was bound to. The third is binding substitution. This is the most sophisticated. Instead of stealing the existing credential, the attacker modifies or replaces the binding itself. They register a new credential against an existing identity, perhaps by exploiting an account recovery flow, a self-service portal, or a weakness in how the system handles credential updates. Now they have a fresh, legitimate credential bound to the victim's identity. The old binding is gone. The new one is theirs. This third category is particularly dangerous because it leaves no obvious trace. The identity record looks normal. The credential is valid. The authentication succeeds. There is no stolen credential to detect because the credential was legitimately issued. To the audit log, it looks like the user enrolled a new device. One more thing worth understanding: binding is not a one-time event. It is a security property that has to be maintained. The credential that was strong and appropriate at the time of issuance can become weak over time. Cryptographic algorithms age. Hardware gets compromised. Biometric systems get defeated by new techniques. And the underlying real-world reality the binding represents, the person's role, their employment status, their relationship with the organization, changes constantly. A binding that was valid when it was created can become a liability when the context shifts. The employee who left last year, the service account provisioned for a project that finished, the contractor whose engagement ended but whose credentials were never revoked. In each of those cases, the binding still exists. The credential still works. The authentication would still succeed. But the trust the system extends when it accepts that credential is no longer warranted. That's why binding isn't just an establishment problem. It's a life cycle problem. Binding is the act of tying a claim to a subject in a way that is difficult to replicate or forge. It is established through proofing, credential issuance, and registration. It sits on a spectrum from trivially weak to cryptographically strong, and it must be maintained, not just created. When the binding is strong, the entire identity system rests on solid ground. When it's weak, or when an attacker finds a way to corrupt it, everything built on top of it is at risk, regardless of how sophisticated the authentication or authorization layers above it might be.